Great. Derek, thank you so much. This is really fun for me. I've been doing, as I said, housing activism for a long time, so I've been a big fan of your work. And it was really exciting to open the book and have the first chapter be all about how the pro-housing YIMBY movement is right about everything. Thank you. But also you start with this blue sky vision, you know, we're almost at flying cars, it's beautiful, I love it. And then we spend chapter after chapter slogging through the mud of process and why we aren't getting that blue sky vision. And I'm just curious, like, how miserable were you doing all the research? Like, did you have fun? Like, do you have a love-hate relationship with the like rock that you're picking up and all of the squiggly process demons that are coming out from under it? Like, was this a fun process for you, or was this like a torture, getting it all down? You know, tell us about the book.
I love this meta question about the emotions I had in writing the book. So first off, thank you so much for coming. This is the last stop of the first phase of the book tour. We did, in order, New York, Boston, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles 2 nights, Palo Alto, San Francisco 2 nights, Seattle, Chicago twice, and now Atlanta. And to give you a sense of my internal emotional weather now, at this point in the tour, I lost my work computer in Boston, I lost my wallet in Los Angeles, and last night, after spending 7 hours in the tarmac failing to fly from Chicago to Atlanta, then decided to come here without my luggage, which is being sent later to my home where I now live in North Carolina. So I feel like if this tour went on another 2 weeks, I'd be like losing fingers, losing appendages. It's really good for everyone, and certainly for my wife and myself, that this tour ends tomorrow. So the process of writing the book is, as you said, the book begins with this I hope fun, sort of sci-fi vignette of what the world could look like in 2050 if we got everything right. It's a world of not just abundant housing and abundant clean energy, it's a world where abundant housing and abundant clean energy make certain things possible that right now are not possible. You know, so for example, like mass desalination of water is an incredibly energy-intensive process that very few countries do, really, except for Israel. But we have a scene where someone, you know, opens the tap water and it's ocean, you know, clean ocean water that's pouring out, except it's entirely drinkable. We talk about technologies like cellular meat, you know, meat grown in breweries rather than cut out of dead animals. Another unbelievably energy-intensive technology that isn't possible unless you have a superabundance of energy and hopefully clean, low-carbon emissions energy. And then we talk about flying cars that work with clean fuels, which are technologies that are being developed both here and, if you've seen the recent videos, also very clearly in China. And so we really wanted to get people dreaming about the idea that progress is real. Progress can happen. A better world is possible. And then we wanted to have exactly the sort of cinematic effect that you described, a kind of smash cut to the present, where rather than build what we don't know, we are failing in many cases to build what we know. Houses are not a next generation technology. Elevator was invented in the 1840s by Elijah Otis. Very, very old piece of technology, and yet in so many cities we fail to build multi-story apartment buildings. We fail to get out of our own way in building clean energy in state after state. Georgia does a miraculous job on the battery technology front. But you look at a place like Massachusetts or a place like California, I mean, these are states governed by progressives who own the disproportionate share of backpack pins that say save the earth, and yet they fail to engage in the very policy measures necessary to save the earth from the effects of climate change that they want to avert. And so again and again in these stories of housing and energy and transit and infrastructure, we just found government, and in particular democratic government of and by and for liberals, failing to achieve its ends, in part because we had amassed a style of process that was keeping us from meeting our objectives. And I would say that the process, so to speak, of reporting on the book was both painful in many ways, like ideologically painful to have to reckon over and over again with the ways that the party that I know I belong to has, I think, failed its own priorities, its own people. And that's, by the way, that's just not my editorializing. You look at population flows. Hundreds of thousands of people are leaving California, New York, Massachusetts, Illinois, Oregon, Minnesota. They're leaving because of cost of living. The biggest part of cost of living is housing. In many ways, they're leaving because these cities and states, often governed by liberals, are failing to build sufficient housing. So there was a pain, I think, in coming to terms with that reality, and I think it is a reality. But I think there's also something inherently thrilling about the idea that you're a dog with a bone in your mouth. You're onto something. You're onto this mismatch between democratic processes and democratic outcomes. And so I like that dog with a bone feeling. And so writing any book is absolutely an absolute pain in the ass. I don't know how many book authors there are in the audience. If some of you find nothing but pure unadulterated joy in the process of writing a 200, 300, whatever, 700-page book, I absolutely envy you. It's an enormous pain in the butt. But you know, it's like finding like a CrossFit instructor who kicks your ass for an hour every Tuesday. It's painful, but you know that you're in it for good reasons.
This is, as somebody who tries to convince people to go and give public comment at obscure hearings, right, where they get to witness this process firsthand, I actually think your book did a great job of like conveying the emotional journey there of feeling like, wow, there's like this opportunity here. We could be making a decision here. We could be moving the ball forward, and then just like being like pulled back, like somebody like the zombie from below, like pulling you down. And like,
I love these evocative images. We're like covered in rock, there's a bunch of worms, and now there's a zombie that we're fighting. See, I could have used this back in New York when we started the tour, and now I'm learning all these wonderful aphorisms at the end.
But you know what I mean, this is my thing, it's like, how do you make this stuff interesting? And you do succeed in sort of like making the painful process of, you know, watching society reach for something and then not be able to grasp it. And you can see that over and over. I mean, to your point, right, this discussion about what do we want to accomplish? What do we want our society to be? And how is that at odds with the process of our decision making? How does the decision making make it impossible currently for us to achieve those goals? And what are the sort of baked in decisions? I mean, we're in Atlanta. It's 60% single family home here in Atlanta, right? Zone single family home where it's illegal currently to build a multifamily apartment building. And instead of really talking about that, we're instead, I mean, I don't know how many people are following like the tree debate, but there's a big debate currently that our chapter of Unhousing Atlanta is working on that, I'm sorry, this is gonna be nerdy, but you're a nerdy crowd, right? That the proposal is that you shouldn't be allowed on private land to chop down a tree if you're building a multifamily apartment building. You should have to replace that tree, even if that means you build less units, you build a smaller building. And it's exactly this, like, I get it, like I read the Lorax, I love speaking for the trees. Like, I think that there's something very beautiful about the urban tree canopy, and yet it's causing us to make decisions that we know incentivize sprawl. We know that the people who are showing up and defending, we must keep these trees, are not necessarily gonna help us figure out where those people in those units that aren't gonna get built are gonna live. And I think this systemic problem, it's very hard, and each snowflake doesn't think that they're part of the avalanche, right? They're like, well, these trees are important. And I think it's a very hard conversation in liberal parts of America and even in conservative parts to have a conversation where you're like, I get it, like I wanna say I like trees. I do, I like trees, but I like apartments more. And how do we sort of have a coherent political conversation about those trade-offs?
Well, it's not trees or apartments, right? In many ways, denser living allows for more wildlife.
But not that tree.
And this is where I think it's important that people understand how environmentalism has changed and what environmentalism means in the 2020s. Like, if you provide two postcards, one postcard of a home in the middle of a beautiful wilderness, and another postcard of an apartment building next to another apartment building, sandwiched between another apartment buildings, you say, which of these two photographs is a vision of environmentalism in the 21st century? There's some people who's going to look at photograph number one and say, I see more grass, I see more nature, that's environmentalism. But it's dense living that allows for more wildness to exist outside of the city. And so I think sometimes it can be hard to really wrap your head around the fact that environmentalism and its meaning has like changed a lot in the last 100 years. And there's a story that we tell in the book, but it's like one of my favorite sort of conceptual arcs that we draw. And I learned this from Larry Seltzer, who's at the Conservation Fund, sort of like a next stage environmentalist, I think. And he said, in the last 100 years of American history, there's really been 3 eras of environmentalism. The first era of environmentalism is the early progressive era of the early 20th century. And this is the environmentalism of John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt. It's the age of what he called conservation. It's this idea that to be an environmentalist, you recognize that there are some parts of America that are just so damn beautiful that we can't possibly allow industry to traipse into them. And so to be an environmentalist in, say, the 1910s and 1920s meant looking at a map of America and drawing circles around Yosemite and Yellowstone and saying, through these parameters, industry shall not pass. And that was a worthy step forward for environmentalism, at least compared to the absolute heinous atrocities that we were committing in the West in the late 19th century. But then a few decades happen, and you get to the 1940s, 1950s, and America is really a very ugly country. The air is disgusting. The water is disgusting. In 1943, the citizens of Los Angeles wake up to smog so dark and thick they think the Japanese have launched a chemical attack. Dylan Thomas, the poet, died on one day in the 1940s in Manhattan, the same month that dozens of people died of air pollution in Manhattan. This didn't make the front page news. It was just a matter of course that in the richest city, in the richest country in the world, in the middle of the 20th century, dozens of people died of air pollution. And so the era of conservation was clearly insufficient to solve the problems of that age. You couldn't solve the problem of air pollution in Manhattan by drawing a circle in Utah and saying we created another national park. You had to create a new set of laws. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Environmental Species Protection Act, Migratory Birds Act, NEPA even. We created a set of laws and even a set of legal norms that made it harder for people to transform the physical environment and easier for individuals to sue companies in the state to stop them from building. And that was a reasonable and even extraordinarily effective answer to the problem of the 1950s. But it's no longer the 1950s. We have a new generation and a new set of problems. And that problem is climate change. It's a globalized problem, not the problem of one despoiled river in New Hampshire, but a problem of global warming and climate change because of carbon emissions. And we simply can't rely on the answers that we had in the 1960s to solve these problems. Because if we're going to continue to populate the earth with new people, and we're going to continue to get richer, and we're not going to try to force people in Africa, in Thailand, in Bangladesh to never get richer ever again, we're simply going to inevitably have more people using more energy for the foreseeable future forever. The only way you can take stock of that inevitability while caring for the planet is to build more clean energy and to develop more technology that allows better clean energy, to be built. And so that requires a new paradigm, not the politics of blocking that became very popular in the 1960s, but a politics of building that we're not yet expert yet in the 2020s. And one thing I think this book is trying to do, especially in the realm of energy, is sort of execute this paradigm shift. That just as it made no sense to build another Yellowstone to fix a river in the 1950s, it no longer makes sense to rely on the same set of blocking politics in the 1960s to solve the problems of the 2020s. And so we really do think that environmentalists need this kind of paradigm shift, right? To see that sometimes the grays of an apartment building are, in a way, greener for the planet than just everybody living 100 miles away from the city center and commuting with an internal combustion engine there and back, even if they happen to live in a house that when you take the postcard is surrounded by a lot of lush wildness.
And I think this is where the young people who are deep in the environmental movement are making that transition. But the environmental laws are all written with this bias towards the status quo. They're sort of like, you're going to have to study, you're going to have to prove, you're going to have to disprove that any change would not have negative consequences, as if the status quo is in fact the environmentally friendly thing, when in fact the status quo is perpetuating and making it impossible to build high-speed rail, build apartment buildings. This kind of concept is rooted into the environmental laws that we have to preserve in order to protect, rather than we have to build in order to not sprawl, which is just like a really different way of thinking about these problems. The environmental organizations also are sort of in this like struggling place. I mean, you look at individual Sierra Club chapters. The National Sierra Club chapter knows that we need to build infill housing, and yet the local Sierra Club chapters are this patchwork. More of them are flipping, it's good, but a lot of them are dominated, I think, and literally by older generations who still have a mentality of, we have to stop the big bad thing. And that is like in their bones, that somebody is gonna come to town and build a big bad thing, and it's our job to mobilize and stop the big bad thing. And it's very hard. I don't know that there are many cases where you really convince many people that in fact, well, you think that the big bad thing is bad. I actually think that's the future of my kids being able to live in this community, and it means that working people don't have to commute, and this kind of like intergenerational conversation where I think young people are more saying the ladder of opportunity has been pulled up. It's pushing people out into the suburbs. It's pushing people into mega commuting and sprawl. And when we have these laws that ban apartment buildings, it incentivizes these developers. The joke is cows don't file CEQA appeals, right? The trees are not filing lawsuits in order to block the single-family homes coming out marching over the pasture land. In any case, I think you're talking really well about this. I'm curious if you think that your book is making a big impact, and you're talking with a lot of people. You've gotten a lot of pushback. Do you think you're changing the conversation within the environmentalist movement? Do you see movement from people who, this hypocrisy that you're often pointing out? Do you think you're making contact with people who are shifting their thinking towards where you're going?
I'll tell you where I think we're making an impact. It's very hard for me to know if we're making an impact among local Sierra Club members. It's not to belittle the idea that we are, but I'm just not getting a lot of explicit feedback. It's just signed the Sierra Club of Denver or something. But I would say on the positive side, and I would love to talk about the folks that are angry about this book. But on the positive side, I would honestly, humbly say that the response has been completely overwhelming and much bigger than Ezra and I thought it would be. The number of governors and senators and congresspeople that are directly reaching out and saying they read the book, they bought it for their entire office, they're giving it to other senators, they're giving it to other representatives, has been astonishing. And
they feel like they're in the mud, I'm sure. There they are.
Maybe they feel. Yeah. I thought sometimes people ask why do you think the book has detonated? And I think I have two answers to that question. One is that to be fair, this is definitely not the only idea for the future of the Democratic Party that's detonating right now. I mean, Bernie Sanders can show up at any TGI Fridays in America, and 14,000 people would materialize outside in the parking lot. So clearly there's this enormous demand for an answer to the question, WTF is the future of the Democratic Party? And we're just lucky and also terribly misfortunate to have published, we started working on this book 2.5 years ago, to publish this book into an environment where Donald Trump is the president, he's an absolute wrecking ball of chaos. Elon Musk is his weirdo duumvirate, Roman leader who's wielding chainsaws and putting on cheese heads and just being just generally very strange. The Democratic Party is also, you'd think this is a great time for the Democratic brand because everyone can just stand up and say, look how weird Elon's being. According to CNN, they're polling at 29% approval, the lowest rate in the history of the time series. So the Democratic Party is enormously unpopular, and there's this huge demand to answer the question, where do we go from here? Because it seems like a certain kind of age or a certain kind of coalition has been exhausted. Biden is no longer the leader of the party. Kamala Harris lost, and she's not a particularly popular leader or a particularly clear leader of the Democratic Party right now. Obama constitutionally can't run again unless there's some kind of like big Bowser showdown against Donald Trump. It's massively unconstitutional in 2028 for Obama. I guess I'm here for it. And so there's this enormous question, like, where the hell do we go? And here's my theory, and I'm genuinely interested in whether this like connects with all of you and also with you. I think that the left has always had a very clear permission structure to criticize the Democratic Party, because they've never really truly felt, at least in the last 15, 20 years, like they are a part of the Democratic Party. They felt like they're insurgents within the Democratic Party. And so the Bernie wing could always criticize the Democratic Party cleanly. And the center left, moderates, have struggled to create a vocabulary for, or a framework for, both representing the party while criticizing it. Like the center left, I think sometimes sees itself as like the last institutionalists of America. It's like, we're all the lawyers in a country that hates lawyers. We're all the status quo defenders in a country that hates the status quo. We're the institutionalists in a country that hates institutions or doesn't trust institutions. It's a very difficult place for any coalition to be. And what this book does, or what this book has been discovered to do by people who read it, even if it's not the way we intended it to be written, is provide a permission structure for the center-left to belong to the Democratic Party while also criticizing. It's created a way for these people to essentially say, like even Gavin Newsom, when Ezra Klein talked to him on his podcast, where Ezra theoretically wrote like 100 pages of this book, which is basically like subtext, F you, Gavin Newsom. Gavin Newsom has him on the podcast, and he's like, I agree with every page of this, man. That's just smooth talking Gavin Newsom. Like, love him or hate him, that man is just honey-voiced and knows exactly
all
what
hair
to do.
Gavin.
But he also, let me try to land this plane. He also, same with Gavin Newsom, he's very, very good at knowing which way the wind blows. The man is a very symmetrically faced weather vane. He knows the time it is. And for him to say, this book is right, recognizes, I think, that there's an opportunity in that center-left lane to run no longer as the institutionalist, but rather as the reformer. I want to reform the system in order to save it. And for too long, I think Democrats have been afraid of this message that says, yes, we kind of run a lot of institutions in this country, but they're broken. They don't work for a lot of people. And that's kind of on us. And we need to hold up a mirror and say, we can fix this, and we should.
I think this is where the rubber will just continue. I mean, you talk a lot about implementation, and it's got me thinking about what does that mean politically, right? Gavin Newsom is a good example of somebody, right, who goes where the wind is blowing. The wind in California has been blowing ever more pro-housing, and he's been getting on board with that and supported every pro-housing bill we've had. And the institutions that he is in direct control of have not been as powerful as they could be to realize that vision. He has direct control over regulatory bodies that could have been directed to crack down on cities who were ignoring state housing laws. And this kind of how do we, and I think this is my question, I don't know if you have an answer to this because you just wrote the book and it's full of good ideas, but how do we institutionalize and operationalize this? Because there are going to be a lot of politicians who, and I love it, right? We're building the parade, they get to the head of the parade. As an organizer, that's literally my job, is to build the parade and be excited when the politicians get to the heads of it. And this kind of work, where you then go through and decide, okay, we have 15 requirements for this government contract, and we're going to cut it down to 2. That requires an iron stomach. And it requires being the kind of politician who can go through and say to each, your coalition that maybe half of them helped get you elected, and say, you're the 3 who are going to get no's today. And how do we actually select for in our in our politics, in our, local politics, state politics, this kind of like ability to this style, right? What you're advocating for is much more of a style of politics, is a framework for understanding our problems, and it's very hard to say like, we're traditionally, we elect people more thinking about what's their policy on X, not what's the way that they're gonna govern that's gonna ensure that we actually accomplish what this person is promising me.
Yeah, a word that I've, is this up?
I heard something pop. I'm not sure.
That's awesome. Here, you want to borrow mine?
Hello?
Yep.
You can come check this out. The question was back. Yes, I remember what the question was. So, I was talking about this book with Southern State Governor, Southern State Mayor at a dinner a few weeks ago. And we were talking about the way that he experiences the NIMBY movement in his city. And he said, here's the problem that I face. The city council is considering a new development. And a bunch of people will come, let's say 50 people will come into the room in order to debate the future of this development. And 48 of them will be against the development. Because the people who show up to these meetings, they tend to be older, they tend to be richer, they tend to be homeowners. And older, richer homeowners have an enormous, rational self-interest, often, in saying, I don't want new housing to be built, I don't want any character of the city to change. He said it's very, very difficult to hear testimony after testimony after testimony of people essentially saying, no, no, no. Now, I will say, I saw one testimony from this city council event that he mentioned, and one was just, it was so crazy, I just had to talk about it. This woman who had a farm near to where this development was going to be built said, this is not a joke, I have horses. And what happens if people at this apartment try to feed my horses? I also have one horse I believe to be pre-diabetic. What if someone feeds that horse an apple day after day after day and kills my horse? Will you save me, recompense me for my dying horse? Thank you very much. And then she walks off. And I'm just like, what the world, this woman, I don't want to belittle the cause of NIMBYism entirely, because I understand many elements of it, but I was like, this woman, my God, was created in a lab by the Indians and sent to this.
This is the escalation of the zucchini woman.
So the woman here, what is the situation? The person is living in this building and buying apples at Trader Joe's and bringing them every day to feed the same horse that's by the fence. It was a very strange sort of diagram to work your way through. But in any case, 48 people, right, say no, this development. There's only two say yes. The entire city council ends up voting against the development. So look, it's just very difficult to say no when you're in the room with all these people screaming at you. And my feeling was look, I'm not a mayor, I'm never gonna be a mayor. A part of me feels kind of sheepish about telling you what to do, but you know that you weren't elected by that room.
Yeah.
That room represents the group of people who on one Tuesday in January of one year happened to materialize in one place to say, save the horses, don't build the development. And you represent the city. And for every lonely hand that's raised in that meeting that says, I would like to live in this apartment building. My friend would like to move to the city. I would like rent to be cheaper. There is 1,000, maybe 10,000 people outside of that room that agree with him. And you represent them. And maybe what political courage means is understanding how to draw the circle of care. That if you draw the circle narrowly to say that it's the room that you care about, the room that you can see, that represents the boundary of your political interest, well then in a way, you're not even democratically elected at all. You're just a person in power who finds himself subordinate to whatever room happens to tell you they want or don't want some certain thing to happen. Just like a sequence of inevitable and never-ending veto points after the moment of you becoming democratically elected. And there just has to be another, you could not, why did you get into the business You could have made so much more money in the private sector. Why get into the business of being governed by disproportionate, undemocratic rules?
This is, I think, one of the hardest things and it's the next phase of this. And the GIMBYs are already kind of like, this process, it's almost impossible to psychologically get over the idea that the people who came out on that Tuesday are in fact not representative. They say, I'm from the community, I've lived here, and listening to 48 people in a row telling you that, it is very hard psychologically, and I want to be like, oh, be stronger, and I say that all the time. I do believe it, and know that the polling is not aligned with those people. We can do all kinds of polling, and we know that they're not representative. Great book, Neighborhood Defenders, all about this. The next step is to have fewer rooms like that, and to have a process where you, in fact, don't debate on a project-by-project basis. You decide the rules, and then everybody who complies with the rules just gets their permits, and we don't have to have that room where the quote-unquote stakeholders come out and have their voices. And this is where, like, the previous decades of politics have been about pulling decision-making down to that smallest room and calling that democracy, right? They've been calling that community outreach, even though we know that it has a bias towards wealthier people, even though we know that it has all kinds of bias towards the person who has 6 hours to stand in a planning commission room and wait for their item to be called on a Thursday afternoon is not an average person.
Well, and what's
But
hard about the
they call
argument,
it democracy.
it's very hard, because the truth is, I think if we're being honest, being really honest, there is a part of us, there's a little part of us that kind of feels like waiting 6 hours in order to say your piece to your representatives is like the highest expression of democracy. It's not.
You know Bernie loves it.
You know, right? There's no point in fighting reality, right? There's a part of us that thinks that the more
And I love it too.
the
I do
more
public comment all
local
the
the
time.
care,
Yeah.
the more democratic the process. And what's so counterintuitive is that the opposite is true.
Yeah.
Is that if democracy is a representation of the votes and opinions of the many, then it's important to point out that some of these local elections have a turnout rate of like 11%, while many of these state and national elections have a turnout rate of 60, 70%. Which means that by one definition of democracy, it is the state and national elections that are 6 to 7 times more democratic, which is to say, representative of the actual ballot box expression of the public. And that sits in a very awkward tension with the fact that we do feel like there is something inextricably democratic about caring so much about the place that you live, that you're willing to wait 6 hours when you're hungry and you need to pee and you're just like, I just gotta say something to my mayor. Like
Yeah.
it feels authentic in a way. And I want to see those two realities side by side. I want to recognize that they both exist. Look, this book is, in many cases, rather explicitly asking the government to run more experiments. And this is maybe an experiment worth running, is a pro-housing, pro-building, pro-growth mayor winning power and saying, I'm going to change the way that we approve developments in this city, and a part of that is going to mean we're not going to have as many development meetings that invite neighbors to come up and talk about how much they don't want development in the neighborhood. It's an experiment that you run, and then the public votes. And I think it's important that people run on the message, on a message that is tied to that decision, right? You're going, I think, to find yourself in a really difficult place if you're shy about being pro-housing, you're shy about being pro-growth, you're shy about being I guess housing growth, I think, are the two nouns I'm looking for there. And then say, all right, and a way that I'm going to operationalize that is that I'm going to make it easier for the state to make decisions about growth that don't invite opportunities for the city council to feel overwhelmed by these processes that we've seen basically stop housing additions entirely. I acknowledge it's a difficult experiment, but I think it's an experiment worth running. And I think it's an experiment that can be framed as one of political courage. Because there's a way in which, and this is where you get into really dangerous territory, but there's a way in which, like, a lot of people whose politics begin with anti-oligarchy are unhappy with this book because it is not sufficiently anti-oligarchy. They want the book to be more explicitly anti-special interest. And I acknowledge that special interests exist and are important. And some of them are corporate, and some of them are incumbent companies, some of them are energy companies that stop the development of clean energy just as much as NEPA, right? But if you think of a special interest as a minoritarian group that exercises its power in a way that prevents majoritarian progress, that room is a special interest. That room where 48 people are showing up and telling you no, 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 and blocking housing development in a housing-starved city, they're a special interest. And it's really, really hard to say that the special interests that exist in this world don't just come with the big, obvious evil empire label of INC, right? Sometimes the special interests are minoritarian groups that live among us and try to preserve power for the few at the expense of the many. And I'm going to be a politician that fights for the many and not just the few. And that means we're going to change the way that we do politics. And I want you to judge me on whether or not I succeed in my goals. But it's going to require a process change because, just going back to the theme of this book, the processes of liberalism have gotten in the way of outcomes. So, it's an experiment that I want to run. I hope more mayors have the courage to do it.
Well, and good news from the field. Evanston just re-elected Mayor Biss, who ran pretty much on this. April 1st, literally.
Wow.
And he ran on, he's doing a big Envision Evanston. It's a suburb of Chicago.
I went to Northwestern, so I didn't realize this was my alma mater there.
Yeah, everyone clapped for Mayor Biss. He just won re-election, and he said it was a referendum on his housing proposals, and he was right. I mean, this was a tough re-election, and I think this is the other part of, I think getting the word out is that actually the early results, and some even stronger results, are in on this experiment. I mean, we looked at, we did a report recently, 95% of state legislators who took pro-housing voices and who championed pro-housing bills in their state legislature win re-election, which is the same rate as everybody else is winning, right? 95% winning re-election. So the voters are not actually punishing people for being the housing champions. And I think there's the myth that they will punish you is so strong.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think it's why, we do need the pro-housing voices to continue to organize and be vocal, because we're never going to completely get rid of the myth, but the results are showing that you can sort of on faith believe that if you operationalize things for the greater good, you are actually going to be rewarded, not every time, but in general by voters. I mean, I think the numbers are pretty good on this.
Look, I hope so. Every election is an experiment, right?
Yeah.
And the ideas that work in one term don't work in the next term. And so I think that there's a section in the end about this concept of political orders, which is the term from the University of Cambridge historian Gary Gerstle, where he says, I don't want to summarize the entire conclusion right now. So let me summarize it this way: every age is a politics that is responsive to the question that defines the age, and the question is often sort of co-created by both an internal crisis and an external threat. It's the question of the 1930s, the beginning of the New Deal order, was this question of how do you deal with the internal crisis of the Great Depression and the external threat of the specter of socialism. And FDR sort of fused the threat and the insecurity by saying, here's a vision of muscular government that takes just enough socialism and infuses it with capitalism and builds a stronger country, and literally builds and builds the Tennessee Valley Authority, roads and bridges and dams. And that was a sufficient answer for American politics for a few decades. But it wasn't a sufficient answer for American politics in the 1970s, because we had stagflation, which Keynesian economics couldn't solve, and the Soviet Union represented a threat to America that was very different than the spectral threat of socialism in the 1930s. And so there was a new political order that was born that really represented a kind of invention of new individualism from the left to the right. There was a new individualism that was ascendant on the far left that was like anti-the-man, anti-bureaucracy, very like Ralph Nader, sue the government, sue the state, sue businesses, that's how you show your progressive bona fides. And then there was an individualism that was ascendant on the right, which was sort of Reaganite neoliberalism, free trade and less regulation. And, you know, we're in an era right now where I think different kinds of questions are being asked. And the answers to those questions I don't think are going to come from 1980s neoliberalism, and they're not going to come from 1930s New Deal liberalism. It's going to require a new kind of synthesis. And the internal crisis, or at least one of the major internal crises that I see, is a crisis of affordability. If you ask Americans that moved from the Democratic to the Republican column in 2024, why did you change your vote? They say affordability. If you ask young people, who historically have been the most progressive generation in America, why did you vote for Donald Trump? They say affordability. At the heart of affordability, the biggest ticket item in a typical family's budget is housing, right? Rent or mortgage. So I see whoever defines the political order of the next few decades, I see their answer being very, very responsive to this issue of affordability. And that's why I think I'm optimistic that an experiment that prioritizes affordability, that prioritizes care for people's affordability crises, is going to be one that succeeds. But it's an experiment you have to run.
Yeah, I think this is interesting also because you're breaking out of the regulation versus deregulation, which I think people keep trying to pull you back into that debate. Is this a book about deregulation or is this a book about regulation? And the way I think about YIMBY is that we're saying we shouldn't have regressive regulations, right? And we should be able to do some horseshoe politics, right? The people on the right shouldn't like them maybe because they're regulation, the people on the left shouldn't like them because they're regressive. And can we find a way to agree on nobody should be for regressive regulations? And yet, we have a lot of them. And I'm sort of curious, like, how do you, this next phase of being out there, the ideas out there in the world, I mean, how are you feeling like of this criticism you're getting? I mean, it's mostly from the left saying you are putting out a deregulatory book, you're putting out, you know, this is neoliberalism. Do you have a sort of direct response to that, or how are you thinking about it?
So I think some of the criticisms of the left are fair, and some of the criticisms of the left are unfair. And some of the criticisms of the left are, like many criticisms, a kind of internal hallucination of the critic that has nothing to do with you. The good and bad news of having a book that sort of enters like the discourse sphere is that people will feel like they will have read it even without having read it. Like they're like by osmosis, they're like, I'm pretty sure I get the gist here. And then they'll be like, you know, Derek and Ezra like want to cut Medicare and Medicaid to the distribution. It's like there's a paragraph on page 7 of the book that's like, here are all of our favorite redistribution policies. We support them. It is always nice when you can just copy paste the page and be like, there's an answer. And it's page 7. Like, at least get to double digits.
Hide it.
So look, but to be fair, some of the criticisms that we received from all corners represent the fact that this is a pretty short book. You know, it's about 240 pages. So I think antitrust has a future in the Democratic Party, and we don't have a chapter on antitrust. And I think public finance and financial mechanisms for helping make certain materials or housing abundant are really, really important for clean energy and for housing. We don't have a section about finance. But then, in addition to, they don't read the book, they read the book and they're right that we couldn't have more chapters on their topic. I think sometimes people get blinded by the power of certain words. And one of those words is deregulation. And maybe one of those words just is regulation. Like something happens to our brain when we hear the word regulation or deregulation. It's as if like it's a call to like man your side, right? It's like regulation, like, oh, good, deregulation, that's for conservatives. Regulation is just a very fancy word for rule. And everyone understands that there's no rule that says all rules are good rules. That would just be ridiculous. We all know of bad rules, whether they're like rules from like, you know, our parents when we grew up, rules in sports, rules in our city or state. Like, bad rules exist. And one of the things that Ezra and I are pointing out is that it's not that we're trying to deregulate markets so much as very often we're trying to, this is Ezra's terminology, deregulate the state itself, which is to say, recognize the rules that exist that make it harder for governments to do what they want to do, and take away those rules, if in fact we want to do them. Like, California seems to me to have really wanted to build high-speed rail in 2008. And in 2009, Barack Obama even allocated $3 billion of the ARRA to make it easier for California to build high-speed rail. High-speed rail does not exist in any form, and it never will exist, because the latest estimate for an entire high-speed rail system in California is $110 billion, and they only have line of sight on about $9 to $10 billion of that. They're building out some connection between Merced and Bakersfield that actually shouldn't exist. They should shut down the entire project, frankly, I think. That is a story that we tell in great detail about the book. It's a story about government getting its own way. The story of Tahanan, an affordable building project in San Francisco, another story about government getting its own way. In fact, public housing laws in San Francisco being so onerous that this affordable building had to be built using private funds because that was the easiest way to get the money. We've talked a lot on this trip about the fact that the Biden administration's infrastructure bill allocated $50 billion for rural broadband and electric vehicle charger stations, of which effectively none were built. And whose fault was that? Was it the Republicans? Was it the ISPs? Was it the way that it was administered through the Chamber of Commerce? The fact is that the priority or the value of speed was never taken seriously. People like Jake Sullivan saying that the benefits of the Biden administration would not be felt in years, but rather in decades. Well, look, I like Jake as much as the next guy, but we vote every 2 years in this country. We vote every 40 years for presidents. You can't say, judge this policy based on what America is going to look like in 2070. Nope, Donald Trump became president, and he's taking every spare breath to knock down everything that Joe Biden did. So, I think that, I get that sometimes the reaction to this book takes these words, like supply side or deregulation, and lards so much ideology on them. But we're just trying to help people see reality clearly. And I don't think that clearly seen reality shows that many of the rules that exist at the federal, state, and local level deserve to exist if what we want to do is match processes and outcomes and build housing and energy.
Yeah, I mean, everyone can clap for that one.
You're my Jeb Bush here.
No, I mean, I think this is where I want to be, right? I'm here. I'm here for it. I'm fighting for it. I'm in the trenches. And there's a lot of it. I mean, you say what we want to accomplish. Some of the problem, not all of it, but I do think some of the problem is that maybe it's the Democratic Party, maybe it's we as a political body, the coalition sort of pull together people who don't necessarily all share a commitment to actually accomplishing the final stated goal. And we do a lot of the way that the laws get passed, the way that we do coalition politics is frequently with, okay, we're going to try to hit as many birds with this one fucking stone as we can. And we're going to try to, I mean, you make this point about the project in San Francisco, right? We're also going to have a program so that minority-owned businesses, we're also going to have a program, we're also going to have a bunch of ADA requirements that are above and beyond what is often required. The levels of additional birds that we are trying to jam in with that one stone, what I think is sort of going to be the hard part for this is once you commit to reaching the goal, you have to get all of the stakeholder organizations who make up that coalition politics to also agree that the goal is the most important part. And I hope that your book helps, the environmental movement say, you know what, we're not actually in love with the particular process of the way we currently enforce environmental protections. I know that a lot of them just think that it's the current weapon they have, and they're too scared to let go of the current way of blocking things that they might know are bad, even though they know that it's a net negative for the environment. And so how do we make them brave enough, to join with a coalition partner that can sort of I think this imagining a new world, they have to feel like we actually can pass bold legislation that's capable of accomplishing our goals, as opposed to the kind of defense politics that is the default state of all of the, I'm part of it, so I can say this, nonprofit industrial complex. That the defense politics that so many organizations think they're playing when they think they're just trying to get their little bird dealt with as that stone goes past is like their only access to power.
Yeah, I take the point. I think, how do I want to structure this answer? You're right. You're absolutely right that the nonprofit industrial complex has enormous grip in the Democratic Party, at the state level, at the local level, certainly the national level. But I also think that there's a little bit of a fever breaking right now.
I totally agree, so there you go.
There's a fever breaking in terms of exactly how much listening is good for us.
Yeah.
So, for example, I've had a lot of conversations with representatives, off the record, about the permitting bill, Manchin Barrasso, and how angry people are. That essentially, you have Joe Biden passing the Inflation Reduction Act, which he touts as being the most important law for clean energy in American history. If you understand clean energy as an economy, as a system, you recognize that yes, it's important to build solar here, it's important to build wind here. But what's also important is that these are intermittent energy sources. And sometimes energy is needed in a place where the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. So what you have to do is build machines for transporting electrons from where they're generated to where they're consumed. That means in many cases you need to build transmission lines which have to be permitted. And right now the permitting process is broken. Joe Biden passes the Inflation Reduction Act and then has an opportunity to pass what should be the obvious next law, which is permitting. Instead, the groups get in the administration's ear and point out that Joe Manchin is too cozy with coal and there's too many giveaways to natural gas. And as a result, you have these groups who think that there's door number one, in which we get a permitting bill with no giveaways, and door number two, where we get a permitting bill that's absolutely perfect and makes the Sierra Club and all the other groups perfectly happy. And the problem is that door number three exists. And door number three is Joe Biden can't point to clean energy successes throughout the country because no permitting law has been passed. And he loses, or Kamala Harris loses to Donald Trump, who guts the entire IRA entirely. That's door number three, and it's the door we're living in right now. So I think there's an enormous amount of, not just anger is the wrong word, recognition is the right word. Recognition that, in fact, there's an enormous trade-off when it comes to, the thought they had is, if we don't listen to as many groups as possible, they'll get angry with us, and we'll feel bad. And they'll maybe make our re-elections difficult. And instead, we're living in a different trade-off world, where we listen to so many different people that important laws weren't passed. And now Donald Trump is the president, and he's going to try to tear down the entire IRA. So I think that this understanding that there is this tension between maximizing listening and valuing speed. And my hope is that we are in the process of commuting from this world of maximal listening, maximal delay, to a world that absolutely values speed as a progressive priority, even when that means that sometimes we just have to cut short the listening process.
That's a perfect place to end a Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so wait for the talking stick, and once you have the talking stick, then you can do that. Here's the thing, I don't move as fast as I used to. I'm going to start over here, I'll move over here, I'll go over there, I'll go over there. Have your questions ready, students.
The only preface I'm going to give is that this is, whatever, like the 11th city that we've done the show in. And around city 2 or 3, it became very clear that one question would always be, how would you fix this very particular transit or housing issue in my city? And while Ezra and I love to pretend to be experts at everything, we're unfortunately not experts in like the nitty-gritty like transit and housing policies of every city that we happen to be spending that 24 hours in. So if you have a question that's land specific, I'm going to do my very best job to be helpful, but also, to be honest, Laura might be more expert on some of these things, so that's my sort of helpful guidance.
That's not fair. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here. I love that in the audiobook that you and Ezra read, it's just so much easier to follow when the authors are the ones reading it, and just thank you for all of your work as well. If that stage is the metro region of Atlanta, then that table is the city of Atlanta. And one of those water bottles is where we sit right now, which is Decatur, Georgia. And do we have any other Decatur people, Decatur City of Decatur people in the room? Woohoo! Okay. So I think that there's a way to answer this question without it being about the local politics, right? Which is, Decatur is a bright blue city. We have, absolutely wonderful school system, top 5 school system in the state. We have incredibly walkable communities, hopefully you saw around you.
I noticed, yeah, beautiful.
We have a declining number of school-age children in this city, and this wonderful, even high-quality school district. We will not have enough students come this new year, and so we have to bring in students from other places. Speaking to everybody in the room, because I think this is something that is truly true about the whole region where we're so fragmented as a region, what are the things that we can walk out of this room and do tomorrow? And that don't rely on the state or the federal level, because I think right now that's not a thing that right now we want to figure out what are the ways that we can drive things forward. So what are some of the things that we can do tomorrow to bring this concept of abundance directly to our communities, and particularly in places in the different pockets of Metro Atlanta where actually a few voices can make a big difference?
I really appreciate that question, and it's really important to me to connect this book to a lot of my writing on what I call like the future of the childless city. I mean, it is just astonishing if you look at the census numbers, the decline of the under 5 population of America's cities. I mean, there's Decatur, but if you look at Manhattan, San Francisco, Chicago, they're on pace right now, if you project out the last 10 years, to lose 50% of their under 5 population in the next 30 years. It's astonishing. I want to offer a humble answer here. Part of this is clearly a cost of living issue, right? I mean, people aren't just leaving the most productive cities because working age parents decide they no longer want to be maximally productive. They're leaving because they can't afford to live in these places. You have an affordability crisis that's driving out families. And the policy levers that I would want to pull exist at the level predominantly of housing. Not only to make housing more abundant because it makes it cheaper for people to rent and pay their mortgage, but also because it can be difficult to reform childcare regulations. I support some reforms, but it can be very difficult. And so the cost of rent for childcare companies is an enormous input when they're charging families for childcare. So I absolutely subscribe to what some people call the housing theory of everything, which is that housing policy is not just about housing, it's about innovation, it's about family, and it's about costs that you might not even think of as being related to housing, including in childcare. And for that reason, I would want to make, one thing that we're trying to achieve in this book is to allow housing markets to work a little bit better in the places that people most want to live. And so what I would want to do, as a sort of the term I use in the book, as a bottleneck detective, is to figure out, okay, what are those bottlenecks here? And what is really constraining housing growth here? If lots of people want to move to Decatur, why can't they? Is there a slowdown in the population? Do we see a slowdown in permitting? Are there certain rules we contribute that to? Is there an increase in environmental review? I don't know the answers to those questions, but I would want to start by looking at the data and saying, where can we clearly see that there's an outcome problem? And then I would want to look into process. Why is permitting declining? The last thing I want to say, though, is that, I think the thing I want to be humble about with this book is, you're not going to solve every problem with these 250 pages. And the problem of decline in fertility is a really, really big and capacious and fascinating issue that I think touches on like a lot of issues that are economic, but also a lot of things that are cultural. And so I want to be honest in my answer that I think some of this is absolutely a story of cost of living that is receptive to economic policies. But when you're interested in the general question of the decline of the under 5 population across the country, that touches on cultural questions that I'm fascinated by, but don't want to pretend are exquisitely sensitive to an abundance agenda.
Hi, I'm just curious if there are any think tanks that you align yourself with, get ideas from, that you think are particularly good right now.
Yeah, the Institute for Progress, IFP in Washington, D.C. does really, really good work on a lot of these issues, especially on science and technology policy. R&D policy is a huge part of this book. And then the Scanlon Center is another think tank in Washington, D.C. that is a little bit more right libertarian coded, but does a ton of great work on state capacity, which is a chapter of this book, and on manufactured shortages. So for example, the United States has a shortage of PCPs, of general physicians in the U.S. And part of this is related to the fact that there was a lobbying effort by the AMA several decades ago to shrink the number of residency slots, which constrains the number of doctors that can essentially be produced by the system. So we don't have enough doctors, I think, in large part because we've created a system that makes it difficult to make enough doctors. And the policy story was initially introduced to me by scholars at Niskanen. So I'm Niskanien, I believe. I'm getting some nods, so I think I spelled it right. Not the best speller. But Niskanen is the name of the think tank. And they do some really good work too. The truth is that I get a lot of my ideas from just random folks on Twitter. Some of these randos are in the front row today. And I would say that in 2008, when I started my journalism career, I was very dependent on think tanks, on institutions for helping me learn about the world. But for a variety of reasons, obviously not just the think tank world, you've seen institutions sort of fragment a little bit, and like individuals are often serving, individual economists and researchers are often serving the role of a think tank. So, I learned a lot about sort of democratic socialism and redistribution policy by Matt Brunig, who I think nominally has a think tank called like the People Policy Program or something, PPP, but I just think of as Matt Brunig, and so that's just like a person that I trust to really help me get smarter about a certain part of the world.
So do you think institutional think tanks are sort of a thing?
It's not, I definitely don't want to predict that institutional think tanks are on their way out. I consider myself a huge institutionalist. Like, I think there should be more think tanks. But the truth is, like, a lot of the ideas that I get and find most useful are just like, some random Stanford psychologist said this, some random NYU economist said this, some random Berkeley sociologist said this. I find it's individuals that I'm learning from, more individual accounts, rather than in 2009 when there'd be a debate about the Affordable Care Act, and I would just call the communications director of the Brookings Institution and just be like, can you tell me who to talk to, because I don't know, and you're Brookings. Right.
Hi.
Hi.
So I haven't read the book.
That's okay.
But, right, because part of the reason to be here is to buy the book.
I would agree with that.
Right. But I have heard you and Ezra actually talking across several different platforms. So my question about deregulation is, we all feel like we needed those because the entities that are going to be building this are going to do what works best for them, right? So they're going to make the most money they can. Are they going to be building for the future? Are they going to, what elements are they going to put in their building? Is it going to be one of those things where it's an earthquake and the building falls down, or, those issues? And we've used regulation to sort of ensure that that's how we get what we get, and because we keep wanting more things and adding more regulations, that's how we've gotten to this place. So how are we going to make sure that we're gonna have the right number of ramps, or we're gonna have handicapped access or whatever, in the kind of housing that's gonna come out of this kind of short permitting process?
Right. Let me try to answer the question this way. I'm a fan of outcome-based rules rather than process-based rules. And I think that, especially in the environmental realm, we've over-depended on process-based regulation rather than outcome-based regulation. So for example, I think the Clean Air and Clean Water Act performed absolute, bona fide, objective mitzvahs for America. The fact that we regulated tailpipe emissions very specifically makes the air cleaner and has dramatically reduced smog in cities with lots of driving. Those I think of as outcome-based regulations because you're regulating, say, a parts per million count, or you're regulating a tailpipe emissions. A lot of rules are process-based, so they allow individuals, they give tools to individuals to sue endlessly, force the state to write, for example, thousands and thousands of pages of environmental review in order to determine if congestion pricing is going to be good for the environment. When you can ask anyone at Brookings or any of the folks I talk to on Twitter and just be like, do you think a reduction of driving in Manhattan will improve the air quality? Right? And so I think that I know that that can, in some cases, be an oversimplified answer, and that there are some cases going to be important processes that are worth holding on to, and maybe even outcome-based regulations that are worth scrapping. But this is why I like trying to put the outcome first. To say, if we're really interested in finding a way to densify this area, what are the rules that no longer serve that purpose, and how do we identify them and name and shame them? And then what are the rules that we think actually clearly exist to protect the water and protect the air, and how do we preserve them? So it's hard to give one answer about like, the concept of regulation. It's not that you're asking to do that, precisely because rules are so diverse. There's just no way to say that deregulation is always the solution or regulation is always the solution. But I think that more of an outcome-based orientation would help us determine which rules are unhelpfully merely delaying processes that we want to expedite, and which rules are there to keep us safe, protect consumers, make the water drinkable. Those are obviously rules that are worth keeping.
Can I add a little?
Please.
I think there's also a framework of rules where they were written with different intentions than we currently have. You know, I mean, I think zoning is the example of the laws were written, and I think you can go through and look in most cases in cities, they were quite explicit that the goal was to keep their communities economically or racially segregated, that there was a down zoning that was a deliberate attempt to keep different people out of the neighborhoods. And then that sort of lost to the sands of time, right? It's not like people necessarily are acutely aware of the history of they feel like this is natural. This is the way it has been now for more than 50 years, is that I've lived in a natural single-family home-only neighborhood, and of course it's appropriate that they shouldn't have apartments here because there aren't any apartments here, and that's the way it should be. And there is this kind of like, we're gonna have to go back on a lot of these rules and say, well, the intentions here were bad. And we have new intentions now, and so we need to actually rehab that debate. And I think that can feel very painful to people who associate the current regulations with a natural state of the universe. Having that political battle is challenging, but I think that folks like this and these sort of thought movements are preparing us ever more to have bigger arguments about these things.
I think another one is parking spaces per unit in apartments.
Oh my God, people go parking crazy. The number of people who have the environment is important to me bumper stickers that are there defending their parking spaces. Just
Hi, my question was more about, so you mentioned earlier that since 2008, basically no high-speed rail has been, developed in California, but in that same time, China's had like 30,000 miles of it. So, and we can't chalk that up to it's communism, right? Because they do have private industry there that built those rails. So what's stopping us from doing that? It can't be just regulations.
No, it's not just regulations, but it's the entire design of California politics. It's the fact that there's no one actually in China. When they build a high-speed rail system, there's someone in charge of building the high-speed rail system. In California, there's no entity in charge of building high-speed rail. There's several different entities. They're competing over. Not only are they dealing with their own coalitional interests, but they're also competing with each other to figure out where the first rail should be built. And so I think there's so many problems with California rail, from the coalitional politics I think made it very, very difficult for it to be built, to the fact that even when you get to 2008 and Obama passes his stimulus act, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, they allocate $3 billion toward accelerating high-speed rail production in California. But there's a rider to the legislation that actually says that the money should be preferenced toward areas that can help the low income and reduce air pollution. And so, because there are more low-income people in the middle of the state, in Central California, they end up moving the project from San Francisco to Los Angeles, which is where it would be most economically beneficent, and also frankly more politically popular, to this Bakersfield-Merced link, which pulls it in-state, but then creates a whole new set of people that they have to work with, and further delays the project. So a part of this I don't think this has to do with communism at all. I think it has to do with state capacity and state focus. And China is in many ways a totalitarian government that the United States should never want to be. But there's a lot of room, I think, between totalitarianism over here and promising high-speed rail and not building it for 17 years over here, right? There's a lot of space there. And we've seen the space that exists. You look at something like the I-95 bridge collapse in 2023, where Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, sees the bridge collapse because of an oil tanker spilling over, exploding the bridge. The bridge collapses. They could go through their typical processes, the same typical processes or similar typical processes that existed in California, where they would go through environmental review, and they'd go through procurement, and they would go through all of these permitting processes. And it would probably take between 12 and 14 months to build a bridge that carries 600,000 cars a day. And instead, the governor of Pennsylvania said, that's crazy, we're not going to do that. We're going to expedite the process and declare a state of emergency. I'm going to say that essentially we're going to accelerate procurement by saying you contractor over there and you contractor over there, both happen to be unionized, get together, build this bridge. They did it in 12 days. So one point that I think is really important, and that I'm talking about more and more, is that the phenomenon of fallen bridges exists all around us. It's up to politicians to determine what counts as a fallen bridge. I think there are cities that have homelessness crises, and that should count as a fallen bridge. And there are cities that have housing shortages, and that should count as a fallen bridge. It shouldn't just be an I-95 bridge that Josh Shapiro says, I'm going to expedite the process and then build very quickly. I should say, he didn't govern like a totalitarian. He governed like someone who has access to state capacity and wants to build what he wants to build. And Shapiro is much more popular for building the bridge quickly rather than slowly. But I think we've just become very interested in this process-based orientation that inevitably delays while making a lot of the individual participants feel like they can pat themselves on the back by listening to all of the coalitions, right? So I want to find the space that exists between high-speed rail over here and CCP over there.
Can I add another, just to your point about housing being an emergency? So before the fires, the mayor of LA declared a housing emergency and issued Emergency Directive 1, which then allowed apartments to be built all over the city suddenly, but didn't really realize that she had left the door open for those apartment buildings to be built also in single-family neighborhoods. And as soon as they were proposed, they tried to walk it back. And they said, oops, we did not mean that. And we weren't in as much of an emergency as we had been before. And they tried to, a bunch of projects had been filed. They tried to say, no, we're not going to accept those projects. And I think this is is housing an emergency or is it not an emergency? Where is the political will and how do we build it the real question.
I have this one over here, and then I'm going to come to you in the center, and I'm going to come to you on the far side, and that's it.
I'll be expedient.
All right, I'm a political consultant and former chief of staff for a state house rep in Gwinnett County, so peak suburbia. And part of, I guess the point you're talking about political courage, maybe pull my hair out. Because a lot of times, the city council meetings, those people who say no are the only people who vote, and I have seen this firsthand. And even within like unincorporated Gwinnett County, which is go to the county commissioners, which is the one thing is it's bigger population, so it's more representative that way. And I was wondering, like, how can you get that to help, like, organize? See, because the one thing is you tell them, like that city council person, yes, we're going to be courageous and do that pro-housing policy. But then they get trounced at the ballot box. For example, in the city of Sugar Hill, there were 3, city council members that all voted for apartments. They all got voted out last year, 2 years ago. And in fact, this issue, particularly apartments, even luxury or high-end apartments, are so toxic. And we have it in an area that is like very affluent, kind of conservative country club, and it got so crazy that they've created a new city out of it. And not only that, in the zoning regulations, no houses smaller than an acre. So how do you deal with that political reality and kind of get the organizing and try to back up those city council candidates who actually believe in growth and housing?
Why don't you start with organizing? Because I have a broader question.
Well, I want to, Jen, can you stand up? Okay, so this is our Georgia Organizing Director. Everybody who wants to start a chapter in your neighborhood, go chat with her. She can help set you up with how to, get your mailing list going and your list. Because right? You're an expert. You're like, where is my chapter? How do I have a list of people? You know that they are in your community. You're there. And it's just a matter of identifying them, getting them on your list, getting out your action alerts, and having your happy hour afterwards where you joke about like how many times does somebody say, I've lived in this community 40 years and I hate it, right? You create some humor, some fun, you endorse candidates, you mobilize, you write your op-eds. Like, I really it's possible. And so I think this is the next step is, go hook up with Jen, hook up with me, and we'll get you a chapter going.
My big picture take here, I'll just go quick. There's turnout, there's persuasion, and that's kind of it, right? So here's turnout. The other part's persuasion.
Persuasion.
I'm not pretending like this is an easy sell in cities where 100% of the local turnout is NIMBY, right? Obviously, that's hard. But I also think that, people are complicated. We're torn between competing interests. I know someone in California, father of a friend, who I was talking to him about his neighborhood in Los Angeles. He lived near Beverly Hills. And there was a hotel project, a hotel and a condo project down the street. And I said, what do you make of this new project? He said, I hate it. I hate they're building it. I hate the traffic. And this is for single-family homes. We don't want any of these apartment buildings. We don't want any of this red. Okay, fine. I said, how's your daughter's house hunt in Los Angeles going? He says, it's terrible. There's nowhere for them to live. That's this really happened. And I understand that it can be taken as a cheap point. But I actually mean it in a deep sense. People are complex. And sometimes getting people to think a little bit intergenerationally, just think a little bit different, might get them to see that their values are actually more capacious than initially intended. That someone who thinks of themselves as being NIMBY is actually extremely NIMBY for their child. And if they recognize that they're NIMBY for their child, well, maybe that little door has been cracked open just enough. You can wedge your foot in there and be like, how other people have kids?
My public comment that got the biggest response I've ever gotten in my life was when I was in I'm going to name Cupertino, my favorite place to rack on, and I said that it's been decades of adding jobs in this community, not building housing, and your kids have been forced to move away. and you are missing your grandchild's first step. And this woman behind me gasped. It hit her, right? She was like, oh my God, that is what is happening. And she walked out of the hearing. And I was like, okay, I just convinced one.
You got one.
I got one.
Thanks for coming. I'm about 75% through the book. I love it. And random question. I came in here with a question, but so much of our conversation has been about dealing with coalitional politics, and I just wonder how much you and Ezra anticipated that ahead of time. So let's put a pin in that real quick. Obviously, we're in Atlanta. A big part of the coalition is the African American community, right? So I think all of us in here who believe in the book are thinking, how do we take this conversation back to our respective communities? And one of the impediments that you guys discussed in the book is like minority-owned businesses being an impediment towards building. So we have to assuage concerns that, okay, someone's going to stand on this project and determine that my particular coalition isn't getting the thumbs up this time. And for a lot of valid historical reasons, Black people, it's going to be really hard. I don't expect you to have an answer for that, but I just, it's just so much of this is just, we want politicians to make a decision, but it's ultimately going to be up to us to build a critical mass to influence their decisions. So I don't know what the question is here. It's really just like, because it's so hard, right?
Yeah, it's hard. Let me answer it this way. One of the difficult things to do with a book like this is to deal with questions that are like, how would you sell this book or how would you sell this book's message to every possible audience? And we've gotten questions like in San Francisco where someone said, how would you sell this book in a dive bar in the Mission? And I was like, I think I would say something like, hey, you know how like shit's just kind of fucked? What was it? What about government like that shit? To get shit done. So there's that sort of, there's a mimetic layer to this book, which I think I would encourage politicians or organizers to pick up, which is like, yes, it's a book about deregulation, it's a book about housing policies, it's a book about zoning and everything vague liberalism. It's kind of a book about how government ought to work for the people, and right now it's broken. Wouldn't it be great if it worked for the people? And the issues that we're fundamentally trying to solve for, like, are the most basic. It's not just affordability, which is so important. It's the good life, right? We want people to have rich, happy family experiences in the place that they want to live. And when you can't live where you want to live, if you're kicked out of your house, if you're kicked out of your city, if you have to leave your state, leave your friends because of unaffordability problems, that's not the way in which that connects is very deep. Like it's practically about freedom. It's like the freedom to live where you want to live. So I don't want to pretend like I have like the perfectly honed bumper sticker for every group. But I do think that there's like a buffet table here that has ideas from which could be constructed the perfect bumper sticker for every group. And it connects to, like, the main dishes are government that actually works, government that recognizes when shit's broken and really wants to fix it, affordability being one of the singular crises of our time, and housing is about freedom. And I think that you can find a way to take from those dishes something that's going to work for different communities.
I want to read a quote from your own book to help with this.
Great.
Too many have bought into a perverse inversion of what the city should be. Cities are where wealth is created, not just where it is displayed. They are meant to be escalators into the middle class. But through bad policy and worse politics, they are closing the American frontier. And I think that message of this stuff is pulling up the ladder of opportunity, people feel that in their lives. They feel that the ability to grow the middle class is being choked off. And I think that that is a compelling argument to people about what is it, as we sort of go through and say, we built these sort of mini flimsy ladders, right? This idea that we're gonna have, when you do an affordable housing project, you're also gonna try to get some of those to be Black-owned businesses. That's not a real ladder. That's like a couple little businesses are benefiting from it. What's a real ladder? It's where you are not beholden to your landlord, you're not getting displaced out of your community, where your kids get access to the highest performing school district in the country, and where there is a growing, thriving middle class that you have real access to, and that you can open a business. You know, I think this is the American dream. You know, it is really about rebuilding that American dream.
Okay. The last question is over here.
Thanks for coming. I guess my question is, I'm glad you brought up state capacity because definitely the regulation, deregulation framework seems to stagnate things pretty quickly. So if you're taking any name suggestions, state capacity liberalism, I know you're talking about a new synthesis. Just want to throw that in the hat.
Yeah, probably not for the dive bar on the mission. But my favorite dive bars in Washington, D.C. absolutely have some dudes who go for state capacity. So, you know, it's about matching the right message to the right audience.
Oh, totally. I get it. I guess my question is, in the research you did, I know YIMBY Action's got a lot of good stuff going on across the country. Are there any examples in like other countries or any other cities where you've seen this kind of policy framework kind of implemented when it comes to housing policy? And if not, yeah, I'm just curious because you brought up China, you know, so.
Japan.
Yeah, I was going to mention Tokyo. I mean, I'm interested in making a collage of many different cities' housing policies. You know, there's certain aspects, not all of it, but certain aspects of Vienna housing policy that I think are interesting. I really like certainly Tokyo's, the aggression with which, the culture with which they build, I think is aggressive. And then also in Portugal and Lisbon and Madrid do a really fantastic job building infrastructure cheaply, building trains cheaply. And one thing I was talking to an infrastructure expert a couple weeks ago about, like, how does Madrid build trains so much cheaper than London or the US? And we're talking about how, like, local politicians there run on speed, right? They run on, I'm going to build the trains quickly. They build the trains quickly. They run for re-election on, see how I build the trains quickly? And it's like it's like the opposite of California. It's like, we're going to build a train. 17 years later. I love that idea of getting that flywheel moving, and you can start to run on the state capacity that you promise, right? That's sort of the Valhalla that you're after.
Okay. I ask because the anti-oligarchy messaging often, like Bernie Sanders often points to like the Nordic model, and so I was just curious. So.